Last month, I sat across from a man named Jun-ho in a dimly lit cafe in Seoul's Gangnam district. On paper, he was the definition of making it. He had a top-tier engineering degree, a prestigious position at a major chaebol, one of those massive family-run conglomerates that really underpin the whole Korean economy, and a salary that put him easily in the top 5% of his peers. He looked the part, too. Impeccably tailored suit, sharp posture, and this very calm, professional demeanor. But as we spoke about his career, I noticed he kept twisting his wedding ring. His eyes were darting to the door every single time the bell chimed. And so I asked him about his latest project, his latest technical project, and I was expecting, a standard corporate success story. Instead, he pulls up his laptop and shows me a series of sent emails. And these were meticulous technical reports, the result of 80-hour work weeks, all dedicated to systems optimization. Each one, and I mean every single one, had been met with total silence. No received, no feedback, not even a single correction or a question. He told me, his voice just dropped to this flat, hollow tone, and he said, "I sit in the middle of the office, but for the last 4 months, I've been invisible. My manager walks past my desk and asks the junior next to me for updates on my own work. At the company dinner, they ordered for everyone but forgot to pass me the menu." It was just a chilling description of what looks, on the surface like a clerical error, a bizarre oversight, but it felt like an execution. Jun-ho wasn't being fired. He was, in this very systematic way, being erased. He described this suffocating pressure that he called the weight of the air, a kind of collective unspoken agreement by his entire team and his management to treat him as if he had already ceased to exist within the organization. And what struck me really was his reaction to this cruelty. He didn't express outrage. He didn't talk about suing for harassment. Instead, there was this profound, aching recognition hunger. He was just desperate for even a reprimand, just to prove that he was still a participant, still significant enough to warrant notice, even if it was negative notice. This wasn't, the kind of physical or verbal bullying we see sensationalized in the media. This was a clinical, institutionalized stripping of his dignity as a professional contributor. It made me realize that in these hyper-vertical, hierarchical societies, of East Asia societies built fundamentally on the idea of belonging, the most dangerous weapon isn't a loud insult. It's the systematic, total withdrawal of your right to be seen. And it raises a haunting question. In a world that's built on hierarchy and belonging, what do you do when the system decides you are no longer there? So our mission today is to take Jun-ho's experience, this chilling sensation of recognition hunger, and move it out of the realm of just a personal anecdote and into the structural reality of the modern East Asian workplace. We're going to analyze how these rigid corporate structures under immense economic pressure are systematically stripping individuals of their dignity. And we're using a stack of sociological and experimental sources to define this new, more insidious form of institutional cruelty. The core concept we're exploring is what sociologists are now calling the core pathology of modern workplace cruelty. It's this erosion of recognition, a fundamental shift from mere physical intimidation towards something much more damaging on an identity level. They call it spiritual deprivation.
To really understand the intensity of what Jun-ho was feeling, that desperate craving for validation just for his own existence, we absolutely have to start with the foundational social architecture, the thing that defined dignity in East Asia for decades. We need to begin with the Japanese anthropologist Chi Nakane. She was a professor emerita at the University of Tokyo, and she had this groundbreaking mid-century concept of Japan as a vertical society, or teichikai.
And this concept of verticality is so key. I think a lot of us in the West, we're steeped in this idea of meritocracy, and we might picture a corporation as just a pyramid chart based on job function or skill. But Nakane's idea of verticality is, it's much deeper than that, isn't it?
It's profoundly deeper. Nakane's key insight was that in the teichikai, the fundamental basis of human relations and the structure of social groups, doesn't matter if it's a village, a family, or a massive chaebol, is place. Place. Meaning your group belonging, your shared space, is prioritized over attribute, which is your individual qualification, your merit, your skill. Your identity is defined by the organization you belong to, not necessarily the job title you hold or the diploma you earned.
So the organization itself defines your ultimate worth and identity. And if you get disconnected from that place, if you become anonymous or invisible within it, that's just devastating to your sense of self, regardless of how good your resume looks.
Precisely. If I meet you in Tokyo, one of the very first questions I ask is not what you do, but where you do it, which company, which university, which group. This vertical structure was never just a management chart, it was a full social map. It provided roles, duties, and crucially, a defined sense of psychological safety and identity. It told you where you belonged in relation to everyone else.
And within that map, the most important relationship was that senior-junior bond.
That's right. The classic relational anchor was the senpai-kohai system, the senior-junior hierarchy. In the traditional, pre-stagnation economy, this structure was so much more than just a chain of command. It operated on a profound reciprocal obligation that really underpinned what we can call the original social contract of corporate feudalism.
Okay, let's spend a moment on that reciprocal contract, because it really feels like this is the piece that our source material suggests has just shattered in the last couple of decades, leading directly to the situation Junho is in right now.
In the traditional stable model, the senpai, the senior, offered guidance, mentorship, patronage, and a deep, indulgent dependence known as amai to the kohai, the junior. Amai. It translates roughly to sweet dependence. And it was the psychological lubricant that allowed this rigid hierarchy to function in a humane way. It meant the senior tolerated mistakes, they offered emotional support, and they used their own position to shield the junior from pressures higher up the chain. That patronage was a form of implicit, long-term protection. It often lasted a lifetime.
So, the hierarchy wasn't just about command and control. The junior was obligated to offer loyalty and deference, sure, but in exchange, the senior carried a genuine, often paternalistic responsibility for nurturing and shielding them. It sounds like the system, even though it was rigid, had a kind of moral ballast built into it.
It did. It offered predictability and security. But this is where we enter what the sources are calling the new pathology. The 2026 Sociological Alert, published in Frontiers in Sociology, highlights how economic shifts have completely destroyed this ballast. They argue that the core pathology of modern workplace harassment, particularly in the faltering protective frameworks of the Japanese Keiretsu and Korean chaebol systems, is this erosion of recognition.
That dramatically reframes the problem. We're moving away from the common image of, a boss throwing an ashtray and towards something much, much colder.
Exactly. The study argues that the issue is no longer primarily physical intimidation or overt verbal abuse. It has become a deliberate, systematic, institutional process of stripping individuals of their dignity as contributors.
And the outcome is that highly skilled workers like Junho are just systematically rendered
invisible and interchangeable within the organizational machinery. That's the quote. When an organization actively denies your history of contribution and your very personhood, we call that spiritual deprivation.
If you contrast that with overt abuse, spiritual deprivation feels more fundamentally identity-destroying. Overt abuse is a violation of the professional contract, but invisibility is a denial of your existence. It makes your professional life an existential vacuum.
It hits the individual right where the teichikai system makes them most vulnerable, their place. If your identity is tied to your belonging and your contribution to the group, and the group silently agrees you no longer exist, you face a kind of a social death while you're still physically present. It's designed to be untraceable, nonverbal, and profoundly humiliating.
That really sets the stage for our first deep dive into how that social contract fell apart. We often attribute workplace bullying to, individual bad managers, but what happens when the economic structure itself starts to demand the cruelty?
Well, we've transitioned from a system of mutual, reciprocal obligation to one of pure unidirectional pressure transmission.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that shift, using a story the sources highlighted. There was a middle manager in Tokyo, let's call him Watanabe-san. He spent 2 decades at the same electronics firm, rising steadily. His mentor, his senpai, had been instrumental back in the 90s, offering that protective shield, guaranteeing him security as long as he maintained loyalty and effort. But fast forward to the last decade, and that scenario is entirely unrecognizable.
Watanabe-san's experience is a textbook illustration of the collapse of the reciprocal contract. What we're seeing across these economies is that the protective side of the hierarchy, that amai relationship, has completely evaporated. It's gone, wiped out by the pressure of prolonged economic stagnation and unforgiving global competition.
So the vertical hierarchy, the teichikai, it still exists?
Oh, it's still there. But the nurturing element is gone. The loyalty still flows upward, but the protection does not flow downward.
And so Watanabe-san realized that his superiors no longer nurtured or guided him. They only transmitted stress and impossible efficiency targets. And when he faced those pressures, he found himself systematically breaking a highly promising junior manager beneath him. not because he was inherently malicious, but because the system itself demanded an intensity of extraction, a surplus value that could only be achieved by imposing constant insecurity and fear.
And that is the core analysis of what the sources call the predatory hierarchy. The crisis stems from this unilateral rupture of the senpai-kohai chain. The senior's nurturing responsibility has utterly vanished, leaving only the kohai's duty to follow. The vertical ladder is still there, but now its rungs are just instruments for transmitting anxiety, efficiency demands, and budget cuts relentlessly downwards.
And this structural transformation leads directly to this incredible observation that institutionalized bullying becomes a perverse management tool.
It's crucial to see this not as a managerial failure, but as a feature. Bullying emerges as a low-cost pressure valve. Superiors who are facing relentless, often unrealistic efficiency demands and existential anxieties about their own positions. They offload that stress down the hierarchy onto their subordinates.
So the company, instead of investing capital in better technology or real management training, it relies on fear and erasure, like in Junho's case, as a zero-cost management tactic to extract maximum productivity.
Exactly. The system converts structural economic stress into sanctioned microaggressions and psychological warfare. It creates perpetual insecurity designed to extract compliance and prevent critical thought. It's a way of saying your stability is conditional on your absolute unquestioning output.
What are the formal names for this kind of structural abuse in the region?
In Japan, the term for this structural power harassment is powahara, or just powahara. The term was coined back in 2002 by Yasuko Okada, as the public finally started acknowledging that this wasn't just individual bad behavior, but a widespread institutional problem linked to workplace stress.
And legislation eventually followed, right? Confirming the seriousness of the issue.
Yes. The 2019 Power Harassment Prevention Act, which became fully effective for large employers in 2020, it attempts to address remarks and behavior of people taking advantage of their superior positions that exceed what is necessary and appropriate for the conduct of business. It's an attempt to legally define the bounds of acceptable hierarchical pressure.
And in South Korea, where Junho works, the term is gapjil.
That's right. Power harassment in Korea is known as gapjil. It refers specifically to the abuse of power by those in a superior position, the gap over those in an inferior position, the yul. The discussion around gapjil has been increasing significantly in recent years because the public recognizes this corrosive top-down abuse is undermining the entire social contract.
Okay, so let's connect the specific tactics of this systemic negation directly back to Junho's story. His recognition hunger was fueled by the silent treatment he got about his reports.
We can map Junho's experience perfectly onto the established psychological typology of bullying behaviors. His situation aligns with the category of isolation. Isolation tactics are designed to make the target socially and professionally non-existent.
Like the silent treatment.
Exactly. Using the silent treatment to ice out the employee, withholding necessary information for them to do their job, ignoring them in meetings, or excluding them from social events. That's precisely what happened when Junho's meticulous reports were met with total, chilling silence, and he was forgotten at the company dinner.
That silence isn't passive, it's an active weapon. And then there's the professional undermining, his manager bypassing him for updates on his own work.
That is textbook destabilization. This category involves actions designed to undermine the employee's competence and legitimacy. It includes failing to acknowledge good work publicly, allocating meaningless tasks designed just to waste time, setting the target up to fail with impossible deadlines, or shifting goalposts without any communication.
So when your manager asks a junior for an update on your project,
it's a direct public denial of your ownership, your authority, and your professional status. It makes your presence redundant.
And the sources also detail a broader category, threat to professional status.
Yeah, that involves behaviors like actively belittling opinions in front of colleagues, public professional humiliation, or unwarranted accusations about lack of effort or loyalty. All of these tactics, whether it's isolation or destabilization, contribute to that fundamental sense of spiritual deprivation because they attack the worker's competence, their legitimacy, and their right to belong.
What stands out here is just how deliberate and pervasive this is when it's institutionally sanctioned.
It is. Research confirms this is fundamentally a hierarchy problem. Most perpetrators, something like 75% of incidents recorded in the studies, are supervisors. This is referred to as vertical violence.
Vertical violence.
And the behavior is prevalent not in organizations with, say, poor HR, but in organizations where abusive conduct has the implicit blessing, or at least the blind eye, of senior executives. This creates a negative domino effect. Stressed, anxious supervisors offload their own aggression and demands onto their subordinates, causing bullying to just cascade downward until it becomes a fundamental part of the organizational culture.
So the organization is not just tolerating the kiss-up, kick-down phenomenon, it's actually structuring the incentives, purely efficiency and stress offloading, to make it the default management style. It moves beyond individual moral failure and becomes the system functioning exactly as it is now engineered to function. A form of corporate feudalism that demands obedience but has unilaterally canceled its protective duties.
We've established that the traditional protective contract broke down, transforming the hierarchy into a mechanism for stress transmission. But the question is, why do workers in these highly educated societies accept this change? Why do they continue to participate in the system that offers so little reciprocal safety? The answer lies in the deeply held cultural belief that justifies the hierarchy in the first place, which brings us to the belief systems underpinning this whole environment, specifically the paradox of K-meritocracy.
The sources suggest a really critical, nuanced paradox in the South Korean mindset about fairness versus inequality. Let's tackle that because it explains why people tolerate such intense competition.
The data is genuinely striking, especially for a Western audience that's often focused on equality of outcome. Recent survey findings in South Korea show a vast willingness to accept inequality. The most recent survey indicated that 64.8% of respondents favored inequality, meaning they believe some people deserve significantly higher rewards, versus only 12.4% favoring equality.
That is a massive ideological gap. So they fundamentally accept that certain people, the talented, the hardworking, deserve higher social and financial rewards than others. This isn't the culture pushing for communism, it's a culture pushing for a hyper-defined hierarchy.
Precisely. Meritocracy is the ruling ideology. From a meritocratic perspective, any quality that arises from differences in ability and effort is entirely justifiable. The deeply held belief is that greater rewards should naturally go to those who possess greater abilities or who demonstrate greater effort and perseverance.
But the crucial distinction our sources make is that while they accept unequal results, they vehemently reject unfairness in the process.
That's the tension point. The vast majority of complaints are not about results being unequal, they accept that life isn't equal, but about the processes being opaque, manipulated, or biased. People take issue with whether the opportunity to pursue those rewards is genuinely fair, and whether rewards are distributed transparently and properly according to objective ability. They accept inequality of outcomes only as long as the playing field is perceived as fair, even if the climb is brutal. This conviction fuels the hyper-focus on resume building and education.
This acceptance of the competitive rule set, though, it clashes violently with the deep-seated cultural need for group cohesion. And this brings us to the story of Satoshi, the worker in Osaka, whose sheer efficiency was treated not as an asset, but as a threat to the collective.
Satoshi's story is a classic illustration of what's called the homogeneity defensive mechanism. We need to understand that East Asian corporate structures, especially the older ones that were optimized for post-war rapid growth, rely on an extreme degree of social and cognitive homogeneity to sustain their efficiency. This homogeneity enables high levels of implicit trust, it minimizes conflict, and it facilitates rapid, nonverbal coordination. Everyone needs to think and act largely the same way for the system to run smoothly.
But if you, like Satoshi, deviate from that collective consensus, if your ideas or your performance disrupt the established pace or standard procedure, you become professionally radioactive. Satoshi was subjected to what was called micro-discrimination, being excluded from lunch, having his desk subtly moved, just the silent enforcement of social sameness.
And that exclusion operates through the subtle yet tyrannical enforcement of kuki, which literally means the atmosphere or the air. Kuki is the powerful unspoken consensus on how to think, behave, and most importantly, how to belong. If you cannot read the air, you will fail.
So micro-discrimination, the silent treatment, social exclusion.
The withheld mentorship, it's a defense mechanism of corporate feudalism. It prioritizes bureaucratic efficiency and group cohesion above all else, viewing divergent identities or disruptive excellence, like Satoshi's, as a direct threat to the operational integrity of the collective.
So the system, when it's threatened, prefers predictable conformity, even predictable mediocrity, over disruptive excellence, because excellence introduces an uncontrollable variable into the strictly defined vertical order. It threatens the kuki.
Absolutely. The vertical society is designed to reward conformity and loyalty first, and merit second. And this desire for predictability ties back to the limits of meritocracy itself. Although systems like university admission and corporate jobs are ostensibly open, the author Park Hwan-il argues that meritocracy often assumes aspects of a caste system in disguise.
How does meritocracy become a caste system?
Because the starting point is never equal. People's points of departure vary dramatically, heavily dependent on parental support, the quality of their early education, socioeconomic circumstances. There is no equality of opportunity that meaningfully compensates for these actual lived conditions. If the children of elite parents have access to better resources and networks, they will overwhelmingly outperform, and their merit will be indistinguishable from their inherited advantage.
Which means what truly determines your path isn't just your ability or effort, but where you started. And the greatest, most visible indicator of that starting position is your academic background.
Inarguably so. Academic elitism, or Gakureki, is the single most defining trait of K-meritocracy. While people might pay lip service to the idea that academic history isn't a reflection of actual ability, in practice, educational background is clearly recognized as the ultimate indicator of ability and the surest means of upward mobility. This fuels a competition so intense, cram schools, ruthless testing, that it defines childhood. Everything is fixated on examinations as the chief, yet ultimately flawed, means of assessing capabilities.
And if you hit the top tier of that meritocracy, if you achieve the academic success that Junho and Minji did, you are supposed to be rewarded handsomely. But our sources point to a profound economic contradiction in South Korea's most critical sectors, a failure of recognition even at the highest level of skill.
We're seeing a severe brain drain, particularly in elite STEM talent, the exact kind of person Junho represents. Despite the enormous governmental and corporate focus on high-tech, elite STEM professionals are fleeing the sector because the financial recognition is simply not there to justify the immense effort required to get there.
Give us the data on that comparison.
The comparison is stark. The data shows that while the U.S. offers a robust 25% wage premium for specialized AI and STEM talent, South Korea offers a mere 6% wage premium for the same high-tier talent. This minimal difference in compensation is clearly insufficient to justify the hyper-competition, the high cost of living, and the immense psychological pressures of these hyper-vertical corporate environments.
So the system perfected the funnel, this brutal meritocratic Gakureki system, to produce the absolute best and brightest, but then fundamentally failed to attach sufficient material value to them, or to provide them with the professional dignity and recognition required to keep them. This failure of value leads us to a fascinating piece of experimental research, one that suggests the dangers of meritocratic intent are not unique to the cultural specifics of East Asia, but are a universal risk when organizations attempt to frame themselves as inherently fair. This research study, conducted by the Wharton Ideas Lab, it introduces a paradox that might seem entirely counterintuitive at first, that the explicit promotion of meritocratic values within an organization can actually increase bias against certain groups rather than decrease it.
It completely challenges the underlying assumption that simply declaring you're fair makes you fair. The researchers looked at the causal link between emphasizing meritocratic organizational values and employment outcomes. They specifically focused on how performance evaluations are translated into rewards. Their core hypothesis was that managers making decisions on behalf of organizations that explicitly emphasize meritocracy would ironically show greater bias in favor of men over equally performing women.
And they designed 3 separate experiments to test this, using 445 participants with genuine managerial experience. The experiment hinged on manipulating 2 core variables: the gender of the employee being evaluated and whether the company's core values explicitly emphasized meritocracy, skill, competence, and fairness.
And this wasn't just hypothetical. Participants played the role of a second-stage manager, tasked with using performance revise to make real compensation decisions, specifically awarding bonuses. This replicated the often advocated 2-stage HR process, where one person evaluates performance and a different person determines the final reward, ostensibly to eliminate bias.
Let's focus on the hard data from the study, comparing the bonus amounts given to equally performing male and female employees in the different conditions. The results, as you mentioned, really strongly supported the hypothesis.
In the meritocratic condition, where the organization explicitly emphasized fairness, skill, and performance as core stated values, and managers were asked to endorse these values, managers exhibited a highly significant bias. They awarded the male employee a bonus that was, on average, $46.07 larger than the bonus awarded to the equally performing female employee.
A difference of over $46 in the setting where fairness was declared the highest virtue. How did that compare to the neutral setting?
In stark contrast, in the updated non-meritocratic condition, where the organizational core values were described with neutral language, just emphasizing the regularity and objective documentation of evaluation, the bias was negligible. The difference in bonuses between the equally performing male and female employees was only $2, a figure that was not statistically significant.
That is a powerful finding. The act of explicitly promoting fairness increased the bias by over 2,300%. It's a profound paradox for any organization that wants to be fair. But the real deep dive here is understanding the why. Why does promoting fairness make managers more biased?
The primary psychological mechanism suggested by the researchers is the role of moral credentials and self-perception. I mean, think about it. When an organization explicitly promotes itself as meritocratic and managers are asked to actively endorse these values, the managers gain a kind of moral credential in their own minds. They convince themselves that since the system is fair and since they work for and endorse that system, they themselves must inherently be unbiased and objective.
So they stop checking their work, they feel morally licensed.
Exactly. This internal belief that they are fair then dramatically reduces their self-constraint. They feel less pressure to monitor their decisions for signs of pre-existing prejudice and less constrained by social norms that typically suppress bias. They feel free to act on existing, often unconscious stereotypes like those about gender, productivity, or even group identity because they believe their motivations are pure. They rationalize that any differential outcome is therefore based on the merit of the performance, not their bias.
That is the ultimate inversion. The belief that one is objective becomes the justification for being subjective and biased. It reinforces the idea that prejudice often hides and thrives only when it can be justified on grounds other than prejudice itself. And meritocracy provides that perfect shield.
And this connects back perfectly to the invisibility problem we started with. The researchers noted something critical about where this bias manifests strongest, in the subtlety of the reward decisions versus the transparency of other decisions.
Explain that difference in observability.
The bias was largest for the less observable outcomes, specifically bonuses and salary increases. It was significantly smaller for more visible outcomes like hiring, promotion, or termination.
Why does transparency act as a brake on bias?
Well, transparency and accountability are powerful moderators. Bias in a visible decision, like firing or promotion, is manifest and much easier for others or even the manager themselves to detect. This poses a serious threat to a manager's self-view as an unbiased, meritocratic individual.
But a bonus.
But recommending a slightly smaller salary increase or a smaller bonus for an equally qualified individual is much easier to rationalize as a minor defensible difference. This subtle monetary reward decision poses a smaller threat to the manager's feeling of objectivity, aligning perfectly with the moral credentials argument.
So if the bias can be minimized through the opacity of the reward structure, if the outcomes are hidden in quiet documents, or in Junho's case, total silence, it thrives, even in supposedly meritocratic, hyper-efficient environments.
And that, in a global context, reinforces the extreme vulnerability of workers like Junho. His performance is meticulously documented, 80-hour work weeks, detailed reports, but he watches his critical reward, which in his case is recognition, disappear without a trace. It is easy for the manager to rationalize that silence as efficiency or discipline, posing no threat to the manager's own view of themselves as an objective professional. Now we circle back one last time to the profound societal cost of this eroded recognition, especially in East Asia where belonging is paramount. The system promised upward mobility and dignity in exchange for absolute effort. When that promise is broken and the individual is stripped of their professional self, the result is a profound alienation.
We saw this vividly in the story of the high-achieving youth in Seoul, Minji. She had the degrees, the languages, the prestigious corporate role. She represented the gold standard of K-meritocracy, yet her story was one of survival alienation.
Minji found that her elite status only made her perfectly interchangeable. She was a high-performance machine, but still just a machine. The system saw her utility, her ability to generate surplus value through relentless work, but not her personhood. She realized that the more she excelled, the more the system sought to strip away her individuality to force her into the perfect bureaucratic mold.
And her ultimate departure from that high-flying career path was driven by the crushing weight of the erosion of recognition.
She opted out entirely. She chose retreat over a system that systematically refused to see her as a complex, contributing person, seeing only her function. And this individual choice reflects a massive social movement, especially prevalent in South Korea.
It does. This profound discontent, the realization that the system is fixed against the average individual, it crystallized into the satirical term Hell Losium, or El Korea, which became extremely popular around 2015.
It expressed widespread frustration among younger Koreans about youth unemployment, economic inequality, excessive working time, the inability to escape poverty despite hard work, and a society that favors vested familial interests like the chaebol. It was an ideological rejection of the competitive struggle.
And that rejection evolved from critique to active abandonment, correct?
Yes. By 2019, the phrase had largely been superseded by taljo, which is a portmanteau meaning escape hell. This shift from merely criticizing the situation to actively seeking total radical withdrawal is absolutely critical. It shows a generation losing hope in reform and choosing self-preservation.
Because what's the logical alternative when the vertical contract breaks down and the system ceases to acknowledge your existence, demanding ever more effort in exchange for invisibility?
The breakdown leads directly to the atomization of the elite workforce. The consequence is the rise of the high achiever hikikomori, the Japanese concept of voluntary social withdrawal, or its Korean equivalent. It's essential to understand. These are not just the troubled youth often associated with the term. They are frequently highly talented, highly educated individuals who opt out entirely. They choose the retreat, the silence of their own room, as a desperate attempt to reclaim self-respect and dignity from a system that denies them both.
And the high density of the urban environment only exacerbates the hyper-competition and existential pressure, making this retreat all the more urgent.
That density is a critical accelerant. Seoul, for instance, has a population density of over 16,593 people per square kilometer. This level of population saturation contributes significantly to the relentless, zero-sum competition for desirable jobs and living spaces, pushing people to their psychological and physical limits. And this crushing pressure is a major driver behind phenomena like the Sampo generation, who abandon hopes for marriage and children because they cannot afford to support a family, or critically, they wish to focus solely on their own psychological and professional survival.
Ultimately, the source material defines the existential cost of this erosion of recognition, linking it back to the core structure we began with.
In a shame culture, where identity and dignity are intrinsically tied to one's acknowledged position and professional contribution within the vertical order, losing recognition is akin to a social death. When that professional dignity and personal identity are systematically negated by the corporate system, when you are Jin-ho, starved for even a negative word, the resulting employee turnover, the decision to leave, is not merely a career move or a lifestyle adjustment. It is described by sociologists as a desperate escape from obliteration.
We started with Jun-ho, the elite engineer in Seoul, starved for recognition and trapped by the weight of the air. And we've traced that intense personal suffering back through decades of anthropological structure, the teichikai, and located the exact moment that structure became predatory, extracting obedience and output without offering the promised reciprocal protection or recognition.
The core issue facing these hyper-vertical societies is the shift from a feudal system with reciprocal protection to a predatory, efficiency-driven hierarchy. This crisis of legitimacy, driven by the realization that meritocracy can be a caste system in disguise, and that organizational cultures can actually trigger bias against those they promise to reward, results in the system consuming its own best resources.
The systematic withdrawal of dignity, the recognition hunger that afflicts the most capable individuals, is the most insidious weapon in this new corporate environment, forcing them to retreat when the organization refuses to simply acknowledge their right to be seen.
The pursuit of ultimate efficiency, when divorced from human recognition, perfected a machine that ultimately grinds down its most essential components.